In the heart of California's inland empire lies a place where serenity reigns, where the landscape stretches wide and vast, and where, for years, the community has embraced the quiet calm of rural life. Olive Dell Ranch, nestled away from the hustle of city living, is a small nudist colony surrounded by nature and framed by rolling hills. To outsiders, it might seem strange, but to the people who call it home, it's peaceful, a refuge where acceptance is as natural as the air they breathe. But on one August morning in 2024, that tranquility would shatter. A community built on trust, openness, and connection was about to find itself torn apart by something far darker than anyone could have imagined. At the center of this peaceful existence were Dan and Stephanie Menard, a couple in their early 70s, whose lives seemed as ordinary and unremarkable as anyone else's in the ranch. They had lived there for over a decade, part of the community, a face in the crowd. Dan was a quiet man, strong and dependable, with years of experience working with his hands. Stephanie, his devoted wife, was warm and welcoming, always offering a smile to anyone who needed it. They had been known for their love of the outdoors, often seen walking hand in hand along the dusty trails, taking in the beauty of their surroundings. Yet, for all their simplicity and familiarity, there were forces moving beneath the surface, forces that no one could see. Behind the walls of seemingly happy homes, under the casual exchanges with neighbors, everyone had secrets, and for some, those secrets could be deadly. On that fateful morning, Dan and Stephanie Menard would go missing. The silence was first noticed around noon, when a neighbor, accustomed to seeing them around, realized they hadn't been out for their daily walk. Then a few more hours passed, and still no sign of them. Calls to their cabin went unanswered. At first, it seemed like nothing more than a small concern, perhaps a routine disruption, until the hours stretched into the evening. And when evening fell, that peaceful community knew something wasn't right. A 62-year-old man with a quiet presence, Sparks had lived on the ranch for nearly as long as the Menards. Reserved, not one for sharing much, he kept to himself. But his behavior recently had raised questions. Neighbors noticed his eyes darting quickly when he passed by them. His movements, once slow and predictable, had become erratic, unsettling. Sparks had always been a man who stayed on the fringe, never a leader, but someone who blended into the background. But this time he couldn't blend in. This time his actions would stand out in a way no one ever expected. It would soon be revealed that the secret he had been hiding for months would destroy the very community that trusted him. The Menards were gone, and something told the neighbors that they weren't just missing, they were lost, and the quiet little ranch they once knew would never be the same again. This peaceful community was about to be shattered by a dark secret. Stay with us to find out the truth behind this mysterious disappearance. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to follow the investigation. The first sign of something wrong came when the sun began to dip beneath the horizon, casting long shadows over the serene hills of Olive Dell Ranch. By this time, it wasn't just the absence of Dan and Stephanie's daily walk that had raised alarm, it was the silence that surrounded their cabin. Their absence wasn't like the usual quiet days where they'd retreat inside for an afternoon nap or a conversation with a friend. This was different. This was an unsettling stillness. Neighbors began to gather, exchanging glances that were more than casual. Questions were asked, but the answers were never quite right. Maybe they're at the store, one neighbor offered, but there was no convincing tone behind the words. Another suggested they had gone on one of their usual nature hikes, something that they loved to do together, and simply hadn't returned yet. But as the hours dragged on and nightfall settled in like a heavy cloak, the concern grew. By now, no one had seen the Menards, not since the morning. No one had heard from them. Not a word. No signs of life. No reassuring wave through a window. And worst of all, no one knew where they were. By 10 p.m., the ranch was buzzing with unease. A small group had gathered at the Menards' cabin, hoping to find some clue, anything that would explain their sudden disappearance. The door was unlocked, as it often was when the couple had gone on one of their many outings around the ranch, but inside, things didn't add up. The living room was tidy, but there were no signs of them having just stepped out. A half-finished puzzle lay on the coffee table, an unfinished book on the armchair. Their jackets, which were normally hung neatly by the door, were nowhere to be found. Stephanie's purse was still in the same spot where she'd left it that morning, but there was no sign of the keys. It was as if they had simply vanished into thin air. With no answers and panic starting to rise, one of the neighbors called Michael Sparks, someone who, though distant, had been friendly with Menards. Perhaps they thought he had seen something. When Sparks arrived at the Menards cabin, he seemed as always outwardly calm, but his eyes, those sharp, darting eyes, told a different story. He scanned the room quickly, never staying in one place for too long. His answers to their questions were vague, almost rehearsed. "I haven't seen them today," he muttered before retreating into his shell, like a man who had grown used to hiding things. But there was something about his presence that sent a chill through the group. He wasn't behaving like himself, and his reaction to the search didn't sit right with anyone. Most people would have been concerned, maybe even a little scared. But Sparks seemed detached, as though he were merely an observer rather than someone who should be actively helping. "Maybe you should call the sheriff," someone suggested. And so it was done. The sheriff was called, and soon a search party was organized. They scoured the ranch in the growing darkness, combing the trails and checking the areas the Menards were known to frequent. As the hours ticked by, the hope that this was just some small misunderstanding began to fade, replaced by the unsettling feeling that something far more sinister had occurred. As midnight approached, the sheriff called in backup from the local authorities, and a full investigation began. They searched the nearby areas, calling for the Menards in the dark, but the search turned up nothing. They found no footprints leading away from the cabin, no signs of struggle, no dropped personal items, just nothing. But one thing did catch their attention. A strange detail that sent a wave of unease through the sheriff's department, a single blood-stained cloth found near the edge of the property. It was small, almost insignificant, but the unmistakable red stain told them everything they needed to know. It was the first sign that this was no ordinary disappearance. This was the beginning of a much darker story. The Menards were missing, and the ranch, once a peaceful haven, was about to become the center of an investigation that would uncover secrets buried deep beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect community. The search for Dan and Stephanie Menard has just begun, but the signs are pointing to something much darker. Could Michael Sparks be hiding something? Keep watching to discover the truth. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss any details from this chilling investigation. The search for Dan and Stephanie Menard was growing more serious by the hour. What started as a missing persons report had turned into something much bigger. The sheriff's office had called in extra help, with more officers and volunteers joining the search. But by morning, they had found nothing, no sign of the couple anywhere. The ranch, usually peaceful, felt eerily quiet. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were replaced with worried whispers from neighbors and the sound of boots on the ground as the searchers walked through the area. Detective Diana Harper, a seasoned investigator, arrived to help. She had been briefed on the situation, and from what she knew, this wasn't just a missing persons case. Something didn't feel right. The blood-stained cloth found near the Menards' cabin, the fact that no one had seen them all day, and the strange behavior of their neighbor Michael Sparks, it all seemed too suspicious to ignore. Harper looked around, taking in everything. She had been on many cases before, but this one felt different. The Menards had been part of the community for years, and it didn't make sense for them to just disappear. The blood on the cloth and the missing phone were signs that something far worse had happened. After a long day of searching, things started to fall into place. A searcher found a phone near the cabin, half buried in the dirt. It was Dan and Stephanie's phone, cracked and stained with something dark, likely blood. That was the final proof Harper needed. This wasn't just a disappearance, it was a sign that the Menards had been hurt. Harper took a moment to examine the phone. This discovery was huge, but it only made the case more complicated. Now they knew that the Menards had been harmed, but by whom? And why? With the phone in hand, Harper was sure of one thing. She needed to speak to Michael Sparks again. His strange behavior was starting to make her suspicious, and it was time to ask him some serious questions. The discovery of the phone changed everything. With blood on it and the mystery deepening, Detective Harper is ready to confront Michael Sparks. Will he tell the truth? Keep watching to find out. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on this case. By the time Detective Harper returned to the Menards cabin, the search was starting to wind down. The day had been long, and there were still no answers. But Harper wasn't ready to give up. Not now. Not when everything seemed to point back to Michael Sparks. Sparks had been distant, almost too calm during the search. His answers had been short, and something about his behavior didn't sit right with Harper. He was hiding something. She could feel it. The phone, the bloodstained cloth, the strange way he'd acted all day, it was too much to ignore. Harper arrived at Sparks' cabin just as the sun began to set. The air was thick with tension. Sparks was sitting outside, staring at the ground as if waiting for her. His hands were clenched into fists, his face tense. "Michael," Harper said, her voice firm but calm. "I need to talk to you again." Sparks didn't look up, but he nodded. "I already told you everything I know." Harper stepped closer, her gaze never leaving him. "I don't think you have. You're the only one who knows what really happened to Dan and Stephanie." He finally met her eyes, but there was no guilt there, only coldness. "I don't know where they are. I don't know what happened to them." Harper was quiet for a moment, studying him. "You're lying, Michael. We found their phone. We found blood near the cabin. This isn't a missing persons case anymore. Someone hurt them, and I think you know who." Sparks' body stiffened. For a second, his eyes darted to the side, but he quickly looked back at Harper. The silence between them grew heavy, and Harper could see his walls starting to crack. I didn't mean for it to happen," Sparks said, his voice shaking now. It just happened." Harper's heart raced as she listened. This was it. He was breaking. She pressed further, her voice calm but firm. "What happened, Michael? Why did you do it?" He closed his eyes, letting out a deep breath. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he finally spoke. "They were going to expose me. They knew about the money, the deals I had made. I couldn't let them ruin everything. They threatened to tell the others in the community. I couldn't let them do that." Harper took a step back, her mind racing as she pieced together his confession. Money, secrets, and a hidden motive, it all made sense now. Sparks wasn't just a witness. He was the one who had killed the Menards. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," Sparks continued, his voice breaking. "I didn't want anyone to get hurt. But I couldn't stop it once it started." Harper knew the truth now, but the confession still felt empty. There was no remorse in his eyes, only fear. Fear of what was coming next. Fear of the consequences. She pulled out her phone, dialed the sheriff's office, and calmly spoke into the receiver. "We have a confession. Get here now. Michael Sparks is under arrest for the murders of Dan and Stephanie Menard." Sparks didn't move, didn't say another word. He just sat there, as if the weight of his actions had finally caught up with him. And in that moment, Harper knew this case was over. But the damage had already been done. The Menards were gone, and no confession could bring them back. Michael Sparks has confessed, but what pushed him to murder? Stay tuned for more updates as we uncover the full truth behind this shocking crime. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to keep following this investigation. The arrest of Michael Sparks didn't bring the peace that the residents of Olive Dell Ranch had hoped for. It brought only more questions and an unsettling sense of finality. The shock of the murders still lingered in the air. The peaceful community, now forever changed by the secrets that had been revealed. The news spread quickly. The once quiet ranch, known for its acceptance and tranquility, was now the subject of whispered conversations and nervous glances. Michael Sparks, a man who had lived among them for years, was the killer. And for the community, that fact was almost too hard to grasp. In the days following his arrest, Detective Harper watched the aftermath unfold from a distance. The Menards memorial service was held at a small church near the ranch. The turnout was large. Everyone who knew the Menards came to pay their respects. But even as the community gathered, Harper knew that the pain of this loss ran deeper than anyone could understand. At the service, people spoke fondly of Dan and Stephanie. They shared memories of their quiet lives, of the walks they took through the ranch, and how they always made time for everyone. Their deaths had left a hole in the community, one that couldn't be filled with words or flowers. But as the service continued, Harper couldn't shake the feeling that something was still missing. She knew the truth about what had happened, but the case wasn't over. Michael Sparks might have confessed, but there was more to the story, things that no one had uncovered yet. After the service, Harper stood alone outside the church, the sun setting behind her. She had a lot of paperwork to go through, more interviews to conduct, but she felt a deep sense of exhaustion, as though the weight of the case had taken everything out of her. The Menards were dead and their killer had confessed, but the motives behind it all were still unclear. What had driven Sparks to kill them? What had pushed him over the edge? Harper turned and headed back to her car, the questions still swirling in her mind. She knew she couldn't stop now. The case wasn't over until she had all the answers. As she drove back to the station, Harper reflected on the community she had just left behind. Olive Dell Ranch had been built on trust, on openness, on people who were meant to share a safe space together. But in the end, it had been secrets, hidden motives, and betrayal that had led to this tragedy. The Menards' deaths have left the community broken, and the truth behind Michael Sparks' actions is still unfolding. Stay with us as we uncover the final pieces of this chilling case. Like, share, and subscribe to follow the investigation until the very end. It had been a week since Michael Sparks' confession. The legal proceedings had begun, but the true impact of the tragedy still hung heavily over Olive Dell Ranch. The arrest had brought a sense of finality, but it had also left behind a lingering sadness. The Menards' deaths had shattered the peace that the community had always known. Detective Harper sat at her desk, the dim light of her office casting long shadows over the piles of paperwork in front of her. She had closed the case, but the memory of it still weighed on her. Cases like this never truly left her. The people she investigated, the lives that were lost, it all stayed with her, haunting her long after the investigation was over. As she looked at the final reports on the Menards case, Harper couldn't help but think about the events that had led to this tragedy. Michael Sparks had been a quiet, almost invisible man to those who knew him. But beneath the surface, there had been dark secrets he had tried to bury in order to protect himself. His confession had come with a broken heart and a man on the verge of breaking down. But it hadn't been enough to bring back the lives he had taken. The community had rallied together after the shock, but the damage had been done. Dan and Stephanie's friends still couldn't believe that they were gone. Their cabin, once a place of laughter and warmth, stood empty now, a reminder of how fragile peace really was. The people of Olive Dell Ranch would never forget the Menards. They would never forget what happened here. Harper rubbed her eyes, exhausted from the long hours she had put in on this case. The justice system would do its work, but nothing would bring the Menards back. She had done her part, but the emotional weight of the case was a heavy burden to carry. For the first time in a long while, she found herself wondering if there was ever really a way to heal after such a loss. Maybe some wounds never really closed. As she gathered the final papers and placed them in the file, she felt a deep sense of closure, but also a sadness that would stay with her for a long time. She wasn't sure if she'd ever fully understand what had driven Michael Sparks to murder the Menards. Maybe it was the pressure of his own lies, the fear of losing everything he'd worked for. Or maybe it was something deeper, something dark that had always been inside him, waiting for the right moment to come out. Harper looked up at the clock. It was late, but she still had work to do. As she stood to leave, she thought about the Menards, about the way their lives had ended so suddenly. She knew the answers, but the questions still lingered in her mind unanswered. What would have happened if Sparks had never gone too far? What would have happened if he had simply walked away? In the end, there would be no easy answers, just the haunting memory of a peaceful community destroyed by one man's darkest secrets. The case of the Menards is over, but the questions still remain. What drives a person to commit such an act? The story may be finished, but the impact of this tragedy will linger forever. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime investigations.